well, part of their art was actually to create something, some clothing, some design, some patterns, from using the wool that they had managed to get from the sheep. Now, I'm not quite sure how much the sheep enjoyed these kids going on, but nonetheless, they got this wool, they had to card it, they went through the whole process. Then they got these berries in order to make the dye, to go into the... They saw, experienced the whole process through which these things came, but they had to do it experientially, not really from books. Then another part where the youngsters actually preparing the ground to plant the seed that would grow the sort of vegetables that they would get later on. It was a view of learning. It was thoroughly, but of course, it made it learn much quicker if they just read a few pages in the textbook and written some essays on it. I have 1.5 allotments, and I find myself learning an infinite amount. Why? Because you want to make things grow, you take a bit of advice, you want to go a little bit more deeply about why these things don't happen and so on. You interact with other people, you then know the sort of things to read, and gradually you build up. John Dewey had lovely examples. He could build up a whole curriculum around cooking. So I think that this idea of teachers enabling young people to make sense of their experience, make sense of the things they want to do. And in order to do that, I think one sees the role of the teacher as ensuring that engagement in the classroom or wherever between the experiences and those deep interests that young concerns and worries that people have, and the kind of knowledge, theoretical, practical, and so on, which the teachers are able to draw upon in order to help young people make that sense. And I think that transforms the view of teachers, no longer the deliverer of a curriculum, but enabling, facilitating that engagement between what we have inherited in our culture, practical as well as theoretical, and the young people, what they bring with them to school. And I think the other thing that this brings us back to in the role of the teachers is teachers are not there trained to deliver, but they're there to enable to think. And one goes back to when I started teaching in the 60s in Camden Town, when there were teacher centres, and where we from different schools would mix with each other, planning the curriculum, planning also how to assess these young people, to know what they're doing well, what they're not doing well. But the much greater weight was there upon the teachers themselves doing the thinking about the curriculum and engage in that ethical thinking about what they saw to be worthwhile, all within, of course, some sort of framework. So it affects our view of teaching. And what is seen too in the review work of place light skits and so on, these young people working with car mechanics. I remember the boy who was really at the bottom of the pile as far as academic attainment was concerned, but there reappearing from underneath a car where he'd been with this brilliant mechanic. And I said, well, something totally pedantic like what have you learned, but I didn't think quite like that. And he said, I really have an understanding now of ratio. By working with this person under a car, working with the gears, he had a concept of ratio, which he would never have had in a month of Sundays, sitting at a desk with one another. And it was created in this independent training provider, and we see many examples of that kind of thing. Next point here then, which I hope we'll consider, is the provision. Because I think one can have all sorts of ideas about how learning really does take place. But we've also got to think at this conference about what sort of organisation is it that's going to facilitate of learning. Certainly it is part of the rhetoric of the government and indeed in many cases there are good examples of it, we can no longer see the school as that's been traditionally the case, going it alone in enabling young people. And I think there's now about 120,000 young people each year who from 14 to 16 are doing a good part of their curriculum in colleges of further education, where they have that possibility of a much more practical work in workshops, in restaurants, in construction places and so on. And one has seen from the evaluations how that has actually transformed their engagement and their enthusiasm for learning. So the notion of cooperation between schools and colleges schools and independent training providers like Skids, schools and work-based training, and particularly, I think, the voluntary bodies. One of the things that we valued very much in our review was working with the detached youth workers, who are working with the most disengaged young people, and where you will really see results happening through that kind of relationship, but without having the standardized kind of curriculum imposed upon them. But one of the problems, and one of the problems that really does need to be addressed here, is the fact that the difficulty of short-term funding for these kind of much more imaginative, non-standardized modes of learning. Because one of the problems that they have, and I'm sure it's wide in the youth service, is that you get short-term funding, and that then increasingly depends upon meeting certain targets. And these are often working with the very sort of people with whom over a short-term time you're not likely to be able to achieve those targets. And similarly with the entry to learning or the foundation learning tier that has come, they're starting, even with some of the most difficult young people, the most disengaged young people, they're starting with qualifications and not with learning. And so once again, I think we're going to see exactly the same problems arising. So how are we going to create the kind of, what is the role of information technology, for example? What is shouldn't the youth service be integral to mainstream learning? Except that then the youth service will say, the trouble is if you become part of mainstream, you lose your independence and therefore the capacity to engage in the kind of learning which you really want. And I think that is a real conundrum. How can we enable that learning to draw upon the incredibly rich resources which are there within the community? So really, finally, by way of conclusion, and I think I'm just sticking within my 20 minutes, for the first time ever in my life, I think that we must, to this 3 days, work upon that notion of a wider vision of learning. We must be thinking of how then can we redefine standards by which young people are going to be assessed in their learning, which reflects that wider sort of vision. How can we create an assessment system? It was about 30 years ago that the Youth Award Scheme, now ASDA, we got together and we set it going in my rooms in Exeter. And I just think that is an incredibly successful awarding body that has managed to find ways of respecting and acknowledging the achievements that young people are doing as they work within the community, as they think out their ways of problem solving and thinking about their work in a way which I think the other exam bodies haven't done. Respect for the active and experiential learning, absolutely crucial to that Deweyan view of life which I espouse. Linked closer to the resources, rich resources in our community. When my children first started at school, I remember in Exeter, or was it Cambridge, I don't know. Anyway, but there was a notice at the door, parents do not go beyond this particular point. School was a place set apart, and I think that is not the case, same as it now, but there's still seen that barrier between what goes on in school and what goes on in the community, and then building on the informed experiences. Problems, language, is constantly bewitched by that use of performance management language. Accountability. I was talking up at AQA in Manchester yesterday. The thing came from the audience, I agree with what you're saying, but how on earth are we going to do this? And yet still there be those parents and people who want to make the whole system accountable, which is a better school and all that kind of thing. How can we practically do the sort of thing which I think we are hoping to do, but within that kind of spirit of accountability which is imposed upon us? And what are the sort of practical arrangements whereby freeing up that kind of learning, and that's what rich a view of learning, using the resources of the community and so on, and yet at the same time is still going to be one where the schools and the colleges are going to be exercising their some sort of control, some sort of responsibility for the young people in their charge. Thank you very much.